Okay, we are now live. Welcome to our webinars, day 2 of the webinar entitled Border Carbon Adjustment in the EU Global Town Hall. We had yesterday the first session, which was if you want, a more of policy, global policy session. Was quite interesting for those of you that haven't seen it. I think we'll try and make the tape available to with the Director General Gerasimos Thomas and a very experienced and knowledgeable panel. Today we move on and we do day 2, which is starting in the first panel, the economic impact of CBAMs, which is going to be moderated by Aaron Cosby. I will then moderate the result of EU public consultation on CBAM. With this, I'll hand it over to Aaron. Aaron, take it away, please.
Thanks, Andre, and welcome to all. There are still some coming in, but in the meantime, let me give you a little background to this session. Many of you were with us yesterday for an excellent session on the international dimensions, political dimensions of the CBAM in the EU. This session and the session that follows are complementary to that. This session will look at some of the economic impacts or efforts, a set of 4 interesting efforts to try to understand the economic impacts of a CBAM in the EU under various different assumptions. And I think collectively they give us a really interesting picture of the possibilities. And of course, the session to follow will be more focused on the EU's summary of the public consultation. So it's a nice trio of sessions coming at the issue from different perspectives. I won't take a lot more time. There are still some joining, but we have a tight schedule and I'd love to have some time for public intervention back and forth with the participants after the speakers have spoken. When the 4 speakers have completed, I'll give more complete information on how that works. But for now, there are 2 ways in which you can engage in this conversation. One is the chat. So if you have questions for the panelists as we go along, please put them in the chat. If you would, moreover, like to pose those questions in person, please raise your hand as a participant so that we know that it's not just an interesting question you've posed for public consideration. You would actually be interested in intervening. I've been assured by all our panelists that they will stick to their time limits, which should leave us plenty of time for public back and forth after their presentations. I'll repeat those instructions after the 4 panelists. But let's first get on to our panelists. We have some really interesting work to summarize in the session and 4 excellent speakers to kick them off. I'm going to start with Alexandra Maratou, Senior Policy Analyst at ERCST. This is not favoritism. The idea is this particular set of work looks at global impacts, and this is, after all, a global town hall. It's a study on key sector impacts in India, Thailand, and Vietnam under different design options for a CBAM. Alexandra is going to present the work that ERCST has been doing in this context. Alexandra, please feel free to share your screen and start your presentation of those results.
Thank you, Aaron. Yes, let me share my screen. Thank you, Aaron, and good afternoon, everybody. Last year, ERCST started some work on calculating the economic impact of the CBAM on exporting countries. The work looked at some key carbon-intensive sectors like cement, steel, and aluminium in South Africa and Russia, and we are now expanding this work to additional countries. Namely Thailand, India, and Vietnam. And today I would like to present some preliminary results of this work. But before I show the results, I will quickly run you through the general approach and assumptions and scenarios to set the scene. The approach is that we estimate the costs to exporting countries as the additional burden incurred by foreign exporters of selected products to the EU 27 in 2023, which we assume to be the first year of implementation of CBAM. And this is assuming that trade patterns remain unchanged compared to annual average trade volumes and values in 2017 to 2019. And this estimation of the cost depends significantly on assumptions regarding the design of the CBAM mechanism that will be eventually adopted in the EU. And we analyze 6 different CBAM scenarios to assess the range of possible impacts. And these 6 scenarios are based on choices regarding 2 CBAM design elements. The first one is CO2 intensity, and the different options that we have set out is that this could be a CO2 intensity specific to the exporting country, like an average of the exporting country, or an EU average, or a differential between the average intensity in the exporting country and the EU. And the second key CBAM design element is whether or not it will be crediting for foreign climate policies entailing a carbon price. So by combining these different options for the different elements, we have 6 scenarios. And for each of these 6 scenarios, we present results for both the case where CBAM will account only for direct emissions and the case where it will account for total emissions, direct and indirect. This slide presents just the overview of the 6 scenarios that I just explained. I will not go into detail. Just to say that the first 3 are those scenarios that assume no crediting of foreign carbon pricing policies, and the scenarios 4 to 6 assume a crediting of such policies. Now for Vietnam, India, and Thailand, there is no currently an ETS or carbon tax in these countries, but nonetheless we have run these scenarios as well using a hypothetical carbon price of 10 euros per ton of CO2. So it serves a bit as a sensitivity analysis. So these slides show some preliminary results regarding steel, and we are using, we don't have time to show for all the countries, all the sectors, so we use Thailand as an example. On the left-hand side, you can see of the slide, you can see the CO2 intensity values that we have used for the calculations, both for the EU and for Thailand. And on the right-hand side, you can see the preliminary results that we get. At the top, in the top chart, you can see the cost in terms of additional burden by exporters in million euros in 2023. So it's the total cost. So in this case, depending on the scenario, it can be up to, well, under scenario 1, it could be up to almost 3 million euro. And at the bottom chart, we show how the CBAM payments per ton of product as a share of the current prices of a ton of product, just as an index for, let's say, competitiveness loss. So in this case, we can see that CBAM payments can represent between 0 and 2.5% of current prices when direct emissions only are considered, and up to 2.7% when total emissions are considered. Next slide. So now moving on to preliminary results regarding aluminium. In terms of the total costs at the upper chart, we can see that this can, we've used, sorry, I forgot to mention that this is taking India as an example. So we can see that under scenario 2, where we use the CO2 intensities specific to India, this can be up to 170 million euros in 2023. This is higher when we use CO2 intensities for India compared to when we use the EU CO2 intensities. And this is explained by higher direct CO2 emissions during alumina production in India. And also, of course, when we look at the indirect emissions and indirect costs, it reflects the fact that the overall the emissions factor for electricity in India is higher than the one used for the EU, and it's overall a sector with high electro-intensity. In the bottom chart, we see the CBAM payments can represent between 1.3 and a little over 7.6% of current prices when we look only at direct emissions. And when total emissions are considered, the picture changes dramatically, given the high electro-intensity of the sector, and the CBAM payments can represent between 10 and 34% of current prices, depending on which scenario we are looking at. And finally, for cement, we take the example of Vietnam. And in this case, in the upper chart, we can see that total costs for Vietnamese exporters of cement could be up to 7 million euros. And in terms of how much these payments represent in terms of current prices, we can see that it's up to nearly 50% of current prices under scenario 2. And this is particularly high for Vietnam. It was for other countries that we've made calculation also high, but particularly high for Vietnam, as the cement sector in this country is characterized by a combination of relatively high thermal energy intensity and also the use of CO2 intensive fuels, mainly coal. And this brings me to some observations from what I just presented. First, that not surprisingly, the choice of the applicable default CO2 intensity values has a significant impact on the calculation of the costs. So, meaning whether the design of CBAM will use EU average values or exporting country values, so on. Then the second observation is that we often talk about, there's often an assumption that intensities in the EU are lower than in the exporting countries. But this is not necessarily the case. For example, I showed some figures for Thailand. for steel exporters in Thailand. Finally, as I mentioned in the previous slide about cement, this was a sector where CBAM payments represent a very high share of the prices. So Vietnam was an extreme case, as I mentioned, but it's also can be up to 25–30% also in the other countries. And that was my last slide. So I pass it on to you, Aaron, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Alexandra. I think this is a really interesting set of results and an illustration of the challenges faced not only by some foreign exporters to the EU, we saw differential types of impacts, but also a challenge for the EU in establishing a single tool for CBAM to cover all sectors. We saw the difference that the different design elements make when we choose different scopes, for example, including indirect and direct emissions. The difference this makes in the case of aluminum obviously is important, and also the difference that it makes in terms of what type of a default value to choose in considering the embedded CO2 emissions in imports arriving at the border and the assumption of whether or not to credit. So the challenge of finding a single instrument to cover the differential impacts that makes in the different sectors is considerable. We'll move on. We'll move on. We'll do all four of the presentations in order, and then move on after that to questions from the floor. I encourage people. Some have already started putting questions in the chat. I encourage people to put their questions in the chat. If we go according to schedule, we'll have plenty of time to address those questions, and the panelists will be reading them, and as will I. So our next presenter is Marc Poulet, the Director for International Trade Negotiations at the Association Française des Entreprises Privées, AFEP, in France. They've done some extremely interesting modeling of the impacts in terms of leakage and various other indicators within the EU of increasing climate ambition, using various scenarios for dealing with leakage, including a CBAM and others. Marc, I'll encourage you then to share your screen and tell us what you've done. I look forward to seeing those results.
Good afternoon. So I will present the study we have commissioned. So as you said, Aaron, it's a study based on a quantitative assessment based on a global equilibrium model. So we basically wanted to understand in the first place what was the possible impact of the so-called climate neutrality in the EU without CBAM or any types of policy measures in place, especially in terms of increasing carbon leakage. And the second tier of the study was focused on measuring the impact of CBAM using this global equilibrium model, and also to compare the performances of CBAM based on different CBAM scenarios with other policy tools, including trade agreements. So I will move very quickly on the tier one of the study. So we have applied this global equilibrium model to have this measurement of carbon leakage. And of course, we had to have a baseline scenario, which was the projection of the EU climate ambition before the Green Deal and before moving to climate neutrality scenario. What is, to be clarified in terms of methodology, this global equilibrium model has also a component in terms of climate simulations and could generate carbon prices. So it's not carbon prices collected from external data, but indigenous carbon prices that have been generated by the model. So what we I've focused on is the additional carbon leakage compared with the baseline scenario, and with some component in terms of also a modelization of R&D, which is quite important for CBAM performances if CBAM is coupled with subsidies. Just very quickly, so on the outcome in terms of carbon leakage, we found out in the study that the so-called EU climate neutrality scenario, so ending up with a reduction of 100% in terms of net emissions by 2050, a carbon price within the EU would of course peak, reaching almost $600 per ton in 2050 compared with the baseline scenario. And that would generate what we have qualified as carbon leakage, so being the difference between the carbon price within the EU and the carbon price in non-EU countries. So assuming in our model that the non-EU country will stick to their NDCs, the original NDCs that they agreed upon under the Paris Agreement. So as you may see, the carbon leakage could reach up to 23% by 2050. So it's the additional carbon leakage compared with the baseline scenario and not the aggregate carbon leakage. So we had also some findings on countries that would likely to benefit the most from the carbon leakage. So in our model, we are limited to scope 1, which is quite important parameter, and we have not included the energy channel. So these projections in terms of sectors and countries benefiting from carbon leakage, so the country where investment would be driven, are framed by these assumptions. Unsurprisingly, the sectors who are the most affected by carbon leakage are the ones that are the most carbon intensive in the EU, so metallurgical industries, chemicals, and then cement in the third place. So moving to CBAM, so it's a comparative assessment. So CBAM was assessed on its own merit, but also in comparison with with one internal instrument, a final consumption tax within the EU, and free trade agreements. One consisting in reducing industrial subsidies mainly in China, one consisting in reducing tariffs on low carbon goods and environmental goods in the WTO, and one reducing fossil fuel subsidies. And then we combine all these agreements and CBAM all together. So focusing on CBAM, so what we have modeled in the study is a so-called tax-based CBAM. So it's a CBAM that would consist in imposing a levy on goods based on imported goods based on their carbon content. And somehow this modeling could be also applicable to a CBAM that would consist in a separate ETS markets. The key assumptions are the same. And so the results in terms of reducing carbon leakage, but also the impact on growth and employment would be quite similar. The formula, of course, you will find it in the report. So the report has been made public last week at the occasion of a seminar that we put together to present the study. So you could find it on our website. So a simplified version of the formula is that we have collected data on average carbon content of imported goods from G20 trading partners. And then we applied on this carbon content the carbon price in the EU, but as a difference between the baseline scenario and the carbon price obtained under the climate neutrality scenario. As in the previous study, we had to put together several variants based on different parameters. whether CBAM was a standalone instrument or combined with the recycling of ETS revenues or CBAM revenues, whether we have retaliation, whether CBAM was applied on ETS sectors within the EU or only on free sectors, or whether we count the UK as a member of the EU carbon market, or whether the UK is treated as a third country. In all these assumptions, the key element was that we have not accumulated CBAM with free allowances, assuming that there is some likeliness that the European Commission would present a CBAM without this accumulation. So the key finding of the study is that CBAM is likely to prove quite performant in reducing carbon leakage, which in our model equals also the reduction of greenhouse gases in third countries. So as you may see, whatever CBAM variant is considered, in the best case scenario, the reduction of greenhouse gas emission in third countries will be above 4,000 megaton in 2050. And could, of course, reach an optimal level if CBAM would be recycled, at least with, will be combined with subsidies that would be funded by the recycling of the CBAM revenues. So that would be mainly subsidies to R&D and the acquisition of low carbon emissions, in the sense that they are meant to improve the performance of the EU industry in terms of low carbon technologies, and also to be most likely WTO compliant or less troublesome in terms of WTO compliance. When we combine CBAM with this type of subsidies, there is also a dramatic change in terms of macroeconomic performance in growth and employment. As you see, CBAM could prove slightly recessive. If we have this input of subsidies, then CBAM would turn positives in terms of GDP and growth. Another important finding in the study is that CBAM could be even more performing, both in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emission in third countries, but also in terms of growth, if it is further combined with recycling of ETS revenues. So we have in the study a specific scenario with redistribution of ETS revenues, still in terms of R&D and acquisition of low carbon technologies. And you can see we have the maximum performance, both in reducing carbon leakage and in growth and employment. In terms of comparing CBAM with other instruments, of course, it's not the main point of today's discussion, but we found out that CBAM would be more performing than an EU-wide final consumption tax, at least in the way we have simulated this final consumption tax. So of course it would be a tax that would impose both on domestic and imported products, with somehow a formula which is quite close to the one used for CBAM. But then we have a significant difference in terms of for the output, in terms of reducing carbon leakage. It's almost 4 times less performing than CBAM, even the worst CBAM hypothesis. So the final important finding of the study is that we could further improve the CBAM results if we combine CBAM with the trade disciplines that have been also assessed in the study. So whatever the combination, so we had basically the combination of CBAM with all the trade rules I mentioned, or CBAM with at least 2 of the trade rules mentioned. And whatever the hypothesis, we have a maximization of the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And they can be almost double in the base case scenario. So the combination with all trade disciplines, and also a positive impact on growth. Whereas the final consumption tax would still underperform with a combination with trade rules. So you can see here on the slide the summary of the data on the performance of the different hypotheses with CBAM and other trade rules. And here a ranking matrix where we also add all the macroeconomic parameters and applying weighting distribution being equal for all these economic parameters. And you would see that in this ranking, CBAM with trade disciplines would be ranking first. CBAM alone, but with subsidies, will still be in number 4. Whereas CBAM without recycling is relatively low in this ranking, but still above the final consumption tax. So this is, let's say, the key recommendation of the studies. So CBAM with recycling is definitely much more interesting. Of course, depending on funds, subsidies are used and whether we can guarantee WTO compliance, and there is this added value to combine CBAM with additional trade agreements. I give back the floor to Aaron.
Thanks very much, Mark, for the summary of a really comprehensive CGE modeling study, an astounding number of scenarios, even just within the CBAM, 5 different scenarios. But I like the fact that you also went wider to consider a number of other policies not traditionally considered. It highlights the fact that our challenge is not just to think about what a CBAM would look like, but our challenge is more broadly to understand how to deal with the competitiveness and leakage impacts of a higher level of ambition. And in that context, of course, it's very interesting to underline the kinds of carbon prices you're seeing in a high ambition scenario. And those are just a differential between an ambitious and a very ambitious scenario, driving that kind of leakage. Again, highlighting the challenge that we face and the reason we're all here. So let me pass the floor over now to our next presenter. This is Robert Jeścik, the head of strategy, analysis, and auction unit at the National Center for Emissions Management, that is Kobiece in Poland. They've modeled the impact on imports, production, and revenue derived in the EU in 6 different sectors in a scenario where a border tax adjustment is applied. An interesting set of results, and I think you'll see some similarities with what we've already seen, and also some differences, obviously, because we have a different approach. Robert, I pass the floor over to you. Please feel free to share your slides and tell us about your work.
Thank you, Aaron. Good afternoon, everybody. It was a very interesting presentation. I haven't seen that before. What Mark already shown, and this is, I think, it's quite impressive because it shows the impact of the carbon border adjustment until 2050, which is quite also challenging in the discussion. I will show you the slides from our analysis we conducted in. I think this is the one. We conducted in September last year, and this was before the, let's say, final decision on the increasing the target for 2030. But we also did the 2 scenarios. So one with the 50% target increase and 55. So I will show you just briefly the results of the 55. This, all the papers you can download from our website. So we did analysis in using also a macroeconomic global CG model. We have a baseline scenario from the GRC GECO modeling. So it also assumed the meeting the Paris Agreement targets by the rest of the regions outside of the EU. So we put the higher in baselines. We had, of course, 40% target, and then we had the scenario with 55% target. But what is also worth to mention when you look at when I show you the results, that we assume the burden between ETS and non-ETS with the division of 57% target for ETS and 48% in non-ETS, which we don't know exactly what would be, because it's under the discussion, and its commission will show us probably in June the attitude. But let's say this is the overall reflection. So we put the sectors which are already in very energy intensive and put on the carbon leakage list in the EU. So it's, of course, they are gathered together. So just to briefly show what is inside this: oil products, which conduct also the refined petroleum products, and coke, chemical production, non-metallic minerals, which is including cement, lime, gypsum, and glass, paper industry, iron and steel, and non-ferrous metals, mostly aluminium. So jumping to the results, the impact on prices and the volumes of imports from outside the EU. So we observed all the analysis was up to 2030. So it's the results are almost in 1 year, 2030. So these are the results for the 2030. So the largest declines in imports in the EU appear in iron and steel. It's like by almost 12%, and petroleum products by almost 5%, and non-metallic minerals by 4.6%. The total decline of imports is, let's say, 0.5%. So it's quite small, but diversified among member states. And the largest decrease occurs in Bulgaria. So you can see this in right-hand graph below the text. So the next with the decline in imports is the Baltics region. So it's Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, then Romania, Finland, Poland, Slovenia, Hungary, Czech Republic, and then it's quite around the 0.5%. Going to the GDP and consumption in the EU in 2030. So we observed the negligible impact on GDP. It's around 0, so it's really negligible. But of course, there are difference between member states, and the highest impact on GDP is for Bulgaria, and it's quite similar with previous and Baltic EU regions, but these are all around 0. So if you look at the scale of the percentage, this is around 0. So when you look at the household consumption, it's also slightly increased, but this is also around the average 0.04. So this is also negligible. But the highest is in Ireland, Belgium, Slovakia, Slovenia. So the consumption effect is mostly driven by the terms of trade improvement, but we do not take into consideration the possible deterioration from the trade protection that you can impose in the different regions. What is also most important in this discussion about the border tax, or CBAM, because border tax we just analyzed is one of the form of the CBAM, and you, Andre, in several occasions you discussed different forms of CBAM, but this is only one of the forms. So if you talk about the revenues for the EU budget, this is around 7.6 billion euros in 2030 alone. So of course, there is also discussion if it's internal budget of the EU or just separately for the EU countries. But if you look at we calculated, of course, at the level of the countries. So the highest incomes from the revenues from border tax would go to Germany, Belgium, Italy, France, and Spain. So let's say all the member states. Poland is, as my mother country, is around one of the beneficial, but it's, you see that the bigger country, the bigger income. I've missed the slide with, I thought that we will talk mostly on the economic side, but if you're comparing the results with previous presentation, we also calculate the emission reduction that would occur worldwide, imposing the border tax in the EU. So the result would be like a reduction of 24 million megatons of the CO2 emission in 2030 alone. So this is not huge, but if you compare it to the increase burden for the sectors that are under this border tax in the EU, and they have to increase the reduction efforts in the EU, this is around 30% of additional reduction. So 10, 20 to 30 additional reduction, percent of the additional reduction. So jumping to the conclusion from the economic impact, so the increase of the production in the EU in energy sectors is around the biggest in the ferrous metals and the non-metallic minerals. The revenues are this said, this is 7.6 billion euros in 2030. This is minor macroeconomic impact, about 0.1 with the increase of the households consumption. What we observe, which is quite challenging and good to look into details, is that the we internally concentrate only on the energy intensive goods, but also there is a let's say impact also on manufacturing, which is not included in the ETS, and it's there is a quite challenging impact on manufacturing. So they are challenged by the border tax and the higher prices. This is also worth to note that we design the assessment on marginal abatement costs, which are in 2030 for the countries that are outside of EU, and they are in line with the Paris Agreement target. So whatever this change, that will impose the changes to the results of this analysis. But what is also different from the previous analysis, that we also calculate the tier 1 and tier 2. So we put the direct emission and indirect emission into consideration. We also put into consideration the prices and the free allocation, which is inside the EU. So that's why the results you see and I shown also include the free allocation in the ETS. That's why they are so small amounts. And I think I will stop with that at the moment. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Robert. A really interesting set of results, and we're starting to see this is the value of a number of different modeling approaches coming from different perspectives. You get into the most interesting part of the discussion, then it falls to what are the assumptions, what's the scope, because we come at it differently. And as you say, it's interesting to look at your study, which considers both direct and indirect emissions, as well as taking into account free allocation. And interestingly, thinks about the split between emissions reductions accomplished within the ETS and outside of the ETS, which is something I haven't seen in other studies. But the results quite interesting in terms of the split among EU members in terms of revenue and also impacts. So thank you for this. As I say, it's we're starting to see some interesting results as a collective body. We'll move on then to the next presenter. After this presenter, we will open the floor to public discourse. So those of you that have questions, please put them in the chat. And also, if you'd like to present those questions physically or in person, raise your hand in the participants so that we know you would actually like to present that question. We'll moderate a discussion after this last presentation. That presentation, the last word falls to Daniel Besley of the World Bank. He's the Senior Climate Change Specialist in the Carbon Markets and Innovation Unit. And he will not be presenting a body of work done, but an ambitious body of work to be done this year. And I think he's probably been furiously taking notes about the results and approaches taken by our other modelers. This will be a CGE modeling exercise, as we have seen others, for an EU CBAM, using a phased approach to including select sectors. So again, a slightly different take and assumptions and scope, which will deliver us, I assume, some interesting new results. So Daniel, please, the floor is yours. Share your screen and tell us about your ambitions for this year.
Thank you, Aaron. I'll just share my screen. So my role at the World Bank is to promote climate action in the Europe and Central Asia region through World Bank operations. And naturally, the focus of the World Bank is the more developing countries in the region. And one thing that's common to many countries in the region, they're fairly carbon-intense economies. So fairly carbon-intense power sectors, energy sectors more generally, carbon-intensive manufacturing, and often quite carbon-intensive export sectors. There are also, most of the countries sort of east of the EU and out to Central Asia are actually fairly trade exposed to Europe. They have quite a lot of trade with Europe naturally. And one thing that this presents to these countries is the risk, is transition risk. One of the things that we're also seeing in these countries, of course, is not a lot of action being taken on decarbonisation. So we're hoping to have sort of more in-depth conversations with country governments in the region about the potential transition risks, about the risk that the rest of the world moves on, decarbonises their economies, these countries do not, and a lot of the goods they may produce may suffer from falling demand with the subsequent economic impacts, reduction in production, employment, and so on. One thing that border carbon adjustments does is make this transition risk immediate and tangible. Transition risk has always been somewhat amorphous in the future, and border carbon adjustments brings it to the here and now and makes it essentially quantifiable. And that we're seeing a lot of interest in the region by governments about understanding what the impact of border carbon adjustments might be. And so we've kickstarted a project that aims to look at what the impact on European and Central Asia countries outside of the EU, adopting border carbon adjustments. As a means to start a serious conversation about decarbonisation. So I'll quickly go through this project. As Aaron mentioned, is underway at the moment. We're hoping to have results between now and mid-year. But I'll give you a brief overview of what we're aiming to do and the approach we're taking. So the aim here really is to understand, as I mentioned, the impact on countries in the ECA region of the EU adopting border carbon adjustments, to highlight the risks of continuing on emissions-intensive pathway to the transition risk, and also hopefully the opportunities and benefits of taking policy action, including supporting new sectors, growing sectors, and potentially improvements in market share for their exports. We will do a regional assessment. So we'll do an assessment of all the countries in ECA to the extent that our model allows that level of disaggregation. It covers most of the countries in Europe and Central Asia, some of the areas that aggregate. So we're using a global CGE trade model called Envisage, based on the GTAP database. We will as well as do this sort of broad assessment across all the countries, we will do deep dives in countries where there's real interest from governments, but presently we will do deep dives for Russia and Turkey, where we know there's interest and where we want to engage more deeply. We'll aim to have results for the regional work by March, and then the sort of deeper dives into Russia and Turkey by June this year. You know, the outputs are the general kind of economic outputs that we'll get by sector, to trade, employment, GDP impacts. We'll get emissions impacts as well. We intend to, as I mentioned, respond to a lot of government requests we've had and initiate dialogue on the impacts of border carbon adjustments and the benefits of decarbonisation. And we're aiming for this project to not so much focus on specific design elements, but more on, you know, the general economic impact and the reasons for then taking action. As I mentioned, we're using a global CG model based on the GTAP database. I won't go into the model in detail, but there's some more information in the presentation if you're interested. So obviously we have to take some stance on how the border carbon adjustment is going to be designed. But essentially the way we're approaching it is to assume that it's designed in a fairly effective way, such that each covered sector pays for each tonne of greenhouse gas emissions they emit. It covers both scope 1 and scope 2. And that they pay the forecast EU ETS price. In other words, the level of the border carbon adjustment is equal to the ETS price. In terms of which sectors to be covered, the way we're approaching this is basically cover those that are most at risk of carbon leakage in the EU. So we use the carbon leakage list that estimates both emissions intensity and trade exposure. Overlay a little bit about what we're hearing about the sectors, but also which sectors are most important in terms of volume of imports. When we do the deep dives, we might include specific sectors that are particularly relevant to those countries. Then we have to map the industries to GTAP sectors and just live with the level of aggregation we can get out of the model. Then make sure we also include sectors in the model that would have subsequent flow-on effects from those covered sectors. And then we're proposing to introduce border carbon adjustments in 2 phases. So very quickly, we use the EU carbon leakage risk estimates to find out who we think is the most at risk. And then we basically rank them based on their carbon leakage indicator, which is a composite of emissions intensity and trade exposure, to arrive at a set of most likely sectors to be covered. And we thought they're likely to go in phases, although it may or may not happen. But essentially, these are the sectors that we're proposing to cover. And then we also match them with the sectors in the GTAP database for our model. In terms of which countries will be covered, we're proposing that all countries in ECA will be covered. There is some aggregation, so ECA means Europe and Central Asia. There's some aggregation. For example, Western Balkans is one group. But there's fairly good resolution beyond that. Outside of Europe and Central Asia region, we're aggregating as much as we can, really, just to make the model workable and actually solve. We will look to get specific results for USA, China, and India, and then sort of aggregate large regions beyond that. We're proposing that all countries and regions would have a border carbon adjustment applied. So in other words, there's no real policy crediting for existing policies. And so all countries and regions have CBAM applied. In Europe and Central Asia region, I think that makes complete sense, because there really isn't enough action to justify not having a border carbon adjustment being applied. In terms of the policy scenarios we're going to run, our baseline is obviously a business as usual scenario with no border carbon adjustments and no response. And the emission level is roughly the NDC ambition level within countries. And then with border carbon adjustments, we'll look to have the EU adopting border carbon adjustment in a phased approach, as I mentioned, and then have a scenario where other countries also start to look at adopting border carbon adjustments beyond the EU. So we are seeing some potential mention of it in North America. And so we're thinking of adding them, Mexico, Canada, and the USA as a block choose to do it. We're considering whether to include China, but we think it's probably unlikely that China would do it given the amount of exports they have. So the EU, and then we're looking at a scenario where the EU adopts border carbon adjustments on all imports to the EU, so beyond the ETS, to see what the results would be like if EU becomes more ambitious. And then we'll have a look at a set of scenarios where countries choose to take action in response to border carbon adjustments. And action will essentially be proxied through running a carbon price through countries that choose to take action. So the first scenario, all countries move to a level of action equivalent to the prevailing European ETS price. And then we'll also look at regional differences. And we can also look at specific country differences, particularly for the deep dive countries. So we could say that Eastern Europe moves first, and then Turkey, Central Asia, South Caucasus, and Russia do not act. So what happens to trade and economic activity and emissions when you get regional differences in the level of action? For the Turkey and Russia, the deeper dive, we'll be able to model more comprehensive policy suites and look at different ways in which they can take decarbonisation action. So just to finish up, some of the issues we're sort of thinking about and contending with as we undertake this, should the project also look at the broader impact of decarbonisation, the broader transition risk rather than border carbon adjustments is a question we keep getting asked. Another is, how would the project change with the publication of the proposals on how border carbon adjustments are going to work that are going to come out in June, July. And another one which is related is, if there really is no policy crediting, when we look at the policy responses by countries, at the moment, the way we're thinking about doing it is taking two approaches. One is, if a country takes action equivalent to the EU, then the EU can choose to not apply a border carbon adjustment to them. Or the border carbon adjustment stays, so that in other words, there's policy crediting, or the border carbon adjustment stays. And you can imagine, no border carbon adjustment, the impact, the policy crediting, the impact on the domestic economy would be better. So we're looking at maybe running both scenarios. But given the difficulties in policy crediting, that's why we're now considering also running scenarios where there isn't policy crediting. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Daniel. That was a very interesting overview of the work you're going to be doing and of the challenges that work faces. A work plan that involves thinking about scenarios for a CBAM, in the middle of which an actual proposal for a CBAM will land, puts you in an interesting dynamic situation. But we'll be looking forward to seeing how that works. In particular, we appreciate as appropriate, the global focus, the idea of looking at what happens if a CBAM is adopted in other countries outside of the EU, and of course what happens when action is taken in response to a CBAM by other countries. So as I say, appropriate for the bank that you think with that kind of a global focus. And of course, we look forward to seeing the results. We do have some time now for questions and answers from the floor. Again, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. If moreover you would like to ask those questions, please raise your hand in the participants list. Otherwise, I'd be happy to relay questions from some of the participants to our panelists. But those of you that would like to actually speak, just raise your hands to indicate that. There are a few in the chat. I would encourage the panelists to look in the chat. There are a few technical questions asking about the assumptions used in the various modeling approaches and questions of clarification. We'll circle back at the very end of this session to a couple of minutes with each panelist to go over some of their thoughts on hearing what they heard from other panelists, what they thought of the questions. And in that space, they can also respond to some of those questions of clarifications and technical questions. But if there are larger questions that our participants would like to pose personally, I encourage you again to raise your hands in the panelists list. We have no hands raised up to this point. We don't have participants brave enough to want to intervene, but there is a rich list of questions in the chat box, and so perhaps I'll relay some of them. I have a hand up from Jan Jaap Nusselder. So if Jan could make an intervention. I'm just testing my technical skills now, whether I can actually manage to unmute Jan.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Please go ahead with your question.
Okay. J.J. Nusselder, OCI Nitrogen. OCI is a fertilizer producer in Europe, but also located externally in Europe. There were many interesting presentations addressed. We have heard cost, we have heard the effect of CBAM on CBAM on trade flows. What I'm wondering is, what is the view of the panelists on internal EU market developments? So basically, I saw that there is a slight increase in sales of outlets for EU producers. Have you considered effects on prices in Europe related to CBAM? And the reason why I'm asking is the fact that as EU producers, you invest in low carbon technologies, and you would like to have a cost price for those investments. So what is the effect of CBAM inside Europe?
Thank you for that question. I think what we'll do is take a few questions and then have the panelists come back, because some of these questions aren't directly posed as a specific panelist. So we'll take a few questions and then come back. Magnus Nielsen also has a hand raised. Magnus, if we could unmute you and have you intervene, and Jan, if you could now mute that, that helps us with our sound quality. Thank you. Magnus, please go ahead with your question.
Yeah, hi. I am independent climate policy analyst in Stockholm. I have two questions. All those studies seems to assume that the rest of the world basically doesn't change. And what we have on the table are promises of climate neutrality at the same pace as Europe. So how long will there be a reason for Europe to apply some sort of import regulation related to climate? The second question is, to what extent have you tried to estimate the retaliation from the rest of the world if Europe introduced some sort of tariffs the rest of the world will not be passive. It will react and probably consume some of the economic benefits for Europe from the CBAM. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. These are some challenging questions based in assumptions about future reality for the panelists and for anyone thinking of modeling the impacts of a CBAM. Obviously, an instrument like that does not land in a static situation, and we need to consider what kind of dynamic results, including reactions from other countries, both economic and political. But of course, very difficult to put into a modeling context. Perhaps I'll go to the panelists. Seeing no other hands raised, I'll go to our panelists to give their responses, and I will take. I'll give the floor in the reverse order of speaking. So Daniel, to you, both to answer the questions that were posed as well as any you saw in the chat. And feel free also to give us a few thoughts based on your observation of other presentations. Just a couple of minutes, because I think we will have some more questions. But Daniel, please go ahead.
Thanks. Just to Magnus's questions, for our study, the point about other countries having quite ambitious net zero targets is a really good one. And I think ultimately that helps to tell the story we're hoping to tell from our report. And that is, look, the rest of the world is moving. And if you don't, there are ramifications. So I think that's definitely part of the story. On retaliation, we did discuss this quite a bit. And the World Bank put out a report last year that looks at some of these issues, and that looks at, what are the cooperation or otherwise strategies that carbon intense economies can take, and what were the findings, and outline some findings from modelling different strategies. Our approach, we decided not to get into that realm and really stick to trying to show some of the impacts of border carbon adjustments and reasons for countries in the Europe Central Asia region to take action. There's a few questions that I'll quickly answer in the chat directed at the World Bank study. There was a good question from Patrick on if Eastern Europe, for example, moves to a similar ETS price, does it also mean a border carbon adjustment? And I guess the short answer is no, we haven't really looked at other countries adopting border carbon adjustments as they take action, although it's a very good question. There's another question from Mikhail about whether we're looking at the EU taking out the carbon price from its exports. And we're not, we're looking at maintaining the carbon price in EU exports, much as it is now. And just quickly, lastly, there's another question directed at our study about China. I think it's a couple of questions making the point that China could well adopt border carbon adjustments. And I think it's a good point, and we should have a think about whether we should include China in that group. Thanks, Aaron.
It is an interesting question, given the transformation of China's economy to something that looks more like a developed country economy with concerns about leakage and competitiveness of their own. But thank you for that. Let me turn then to Robert. Robert, again, any questions directed specifically at your study? Any thoughts you have on what you've heard from other panelists? And if you'd like to comment on questions more generally directed in the chat, please do that. Just a couple of minutes. I still do hope to get more questions in. Robert, please go ahead.
Thank you, Aaron. So maybe I will jump to the, try to answer the question what has been raised our participant. So of course, I've just shown the basic results of our study. You can see the overall results in the reports from our website. I just put it in the chat. But of course, we analyze also observed the increase of the prices and product exported from the EU, and the decline of the value of the exports. So this results in the prices of export goods in the sectors covered by the border tax adjustment will grow by about 0.2%. So it is not much. But of course, the increase will be different between sectors. So we observe that the highest will be in the sectors of ferrous metals by 0.4%, and the value of export in the sectors covered by the border tax will be around -1%. But average all the sectors, if you take all the sector into account, the average change in exports in the regions outside the EU will be around 0.7, so -0.7, and the largest will occur in Bulgaria, Baltic states, and Poland. So overall response is that the border tax introduced in EU, both sides increase the prices, both the goods that are imported to the EU and the ones that are exported to the EU. So the results, we calculate both sides. You can see the full results in the study.
Thank you, Robert. So before I go to the last two panelists in this round of responses, we do have one hand up from Nicholas Papanikos, and as well, Richard Baron has asked a few questions. I'm not sure if he's willing to take the floor or not, but let's first go to Nicholas. And looks like Richard thereafter, yes. So Nicholas, you have the floor. We can't hear you. And while we're waiting for a technical, hello? Yes, hello.
Thank you, and sorry for this sort of technical problem.
No problem.
You are not very lucky to see me today. I hope you can see me some other time, so I'm not so happy. You can imagine.
Hopefully we can all be together physically at some other time. Yeah. Please go ahead.
There are two technical questions related to the feasibility of CBAM in principle. I have seen lately Mr. Biden's commitment to go back in the green, in the Paris Agreement. This is the first important point for me. The second point is that as long as Mr. Biden will go in this thing, most probably I think that our European leaders will think twice to take something that could be considered a unilateral move. That means that either everything will go under CBAM or nothing. This is my personal opinion. It's not addressed and not triggered by anything which is very, let's say, official at the moment. And the second, this was a remark which probably may trigger additional discussions from our very, very interesting panelists around. Now, the second thing is this. We have a target in 2030, which is a very, very big milestone for the decarbonization around the earth. And let's say that we're designing one thing that is going to help us avoid the carbon leakage, and the target is 2030. We have 9 years to see some results out of it. Are there any real technical and detailed plans on how this will be implemented in the non-easy products? Most probably you can do it in steel, you can do it in aluminium plates. Some may argue, some may not argue. But is it possible to make a carbon adjustment mechanism and implement it in, let's say, and please, I don't have anything about China or Algeria, but let's find a factory in the Far East that somebody will mark, will grade, and will put a carbon content in a kid's toy, let's say that. Very, very simple and very simplistic probably. Has anybody seen any solid technical mechanism of how this will be implemented? This is the first question. And
for the sake of brevity, maybe I'll ask you to just either focus only on that question or very quickly state your second question.
Yes, and sorry for taking a lot of time of yours.
No problem.
Thank you.
So again, before I go to Alexandra and Mark, let me take one more question from the floor. John Strand has his hand up. I'll unmute, and John, please go ahead. And then we'll go to Mark and Alexandra for their responses in general and to their specific questions. John, please, the floor is yours. So we don't hear you right now, John. It may be that you are muted. But we still don't hear you. Let me go then to Mark while we sort out our technical difficulties with John. Mark, there have been a few questions posed specifically to your study in the chat, and if you'd like to also give us any thoughts you have on what you've heard from others and in the way of others' presentations, briefly, the floor is yours to come in. Thank you, Mark.
So I will maybe start with the general questions. So at least in our modeling, the key point was precisely to modelize to have a modeling for the impact on prices on the internal market. So this is a key element because, of course, CBAM would increase prices within the internal market, at least in the first place. But of course, in a global equilibrium modeling, you would have all the effect of more than 30 years. So at the very beginning, you have let's say, basic increase of prices on the internal market. But then, especially when you have complementary measures to help companies moving to low carbon technologies, of course, price within the internal market will decrease over the time based on this technological improvement. Still general questions. At least in our case, we have a modeling of retaliation. We have opted for the easiest solution, so one-to-one retaliation from all the countries that are likely to be subject to, I mean, those products are likely to be subject to the CBAM. And on the same sectors. So as you could see in the slides, so the slides are also on our website, there is the biggest impact of retaliation one-to-one would be on the level of greenhouse gas emissions. They would be less effective. But the impact on growth would be almost the same as without retaliation. And still, last question I saw, general questions. In our modeling, we have not taken into account possible MFN exemptions or derogation. So the assumption was that all countries would be subject to the CBAM. So it was really to have an idea of the scale and for the specific questions. Indeed, the level of carbon leakage reduction or greenhouse gas emission reduction is cumulative over the period in the slides. We could not, for the sake of time and at the time we launched the study, to take into account the new targets by third countries. So it is essentially a conservative scenario based on the existing NDCs previous to the new announcement by China and Japan and possibly US at some point. And I think the last specific question I saw, I saw two more questions. So the level of carbon price correspond to the level of carbon price reflects the EU carbon emission ambition for 2050. So it was really generated by the model. This is the reason why it is so high. But we see that at least for 2030, the simulation by our model are quite in line with the price that are likely to be achieved in our estimate. I think I replied to most questions.
Thank you, Mark. And as you say, yes, shockingly high price, but in line with the kind of ambition you're modeling out to 2050. So the impacts and the results are not surprising, I guess. So Alexandra, we go to you for any. There were a few specific questions addressed to the methodology and assumptions of the model you use. So I give you the floor both to respond to those questions and to offer any thoughts in response to general questions that were addressed to all panelists. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Aaron. Yeah, on one of the questions in the chat was about the CBAM payment as a share to current prices as an index of competitiveness loss. And indeed, it has its limitations because indeed exporters could increase prices and pass through some of these costs. The work we've done has not looked at the effect on pricing, and it's a static approach in the sense that we look at the costs faced by foreign exporters if they would pay at what they would pay at the border, assuming same quantities exported as in the past 3 years. Yeah, on effects on pricing, yeah, as I said, we are not looking at that, but indeed for sectors that currently enjoy free allocation, we could theoretically anticipate that if you introduce CBAM and at the same time remove free allocations of allowances, then this would lead to an increase in the pass-through of the cost of CO2. And perhaps the relative competitiveness impact would be modest. But this is in theory, and in practice, it depends on sectors' characteristics and the industry structure in the exporting countries. So let's say if the sector, if the exporting country, if the industry is heavily subsidized by the state, they might be able to, they might choose to absorb the cost and not pass it through. On the question on crediting, in our study, we only take into account price-based policies like ETS or system or carbon tax, but indeed it's a challenge, I suppose, for the EU as well in the design and for practitioners trying to estimate impacts, how to credit also for other regulatory-based policies. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Alessandra. There were a few other questions in the chat. I see nobody wanted to take a hand, so let me champion some of the questions I see that I think are still open. One related to WTO compatibility of measures, but I think that is actually a subject for another panel or another entire day session. So I don't know if it's fair to ask the panel to respond to this, given our mandate. We have questions about the ability of the modeling or the appropriateness of the modeling to go down to downstream to manufactured products and the implications of not doing so. So if we're only covering basic materials, what kind of competitiveness implications, leakage implications do we have downstream? And of course, the answer is going to be different in different sectors because some sectors are very straightforward, others more complex in the downstream. Other questions about crediting in light of free allowances granted in the EU or assumptions about free allowances granted in other countries where we're assuming action in other countries. So I'm going to come back to the panelists one more time for closing thoughts of 1 or 2 minutes, but first I have a hand up from Richard Baron. Richard, please go ahead with your thoughts. You have the honor of being the last public participant voice on this session, and then I'm going to go back to our panelists for closing thoughts. Richard, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll be very brief because a number of questions on the technical side were addressed by panelists so far. I have one question maybe on that relates to the optics of some of the scenarios that are being put out. The first one relates to Danielle's scenario on taxing all imports into the EU. If the logic was primarily to make sure that carbon leakage could be effectively avoided, I just wonder about having a scenario that puts out such a radical approach where, you know, leakage has never been shown to be an issue on all these other sectors outside the ones we're dealing with here. So it's an interesting technical thing that one can do with a model. I wonder about putting this out and really putting a bad tone on the idea of CBAM, which is already a very difficult one with the rest of the world. In the same vein, thank you, Mark, for the presentation of the AFEP work. You are showing a very positive macroeconomic effects on the EU of the CBAM. And to me, this projects a very ambiguous picture to the rest of the world. We tax your imports and we are making significant economic gains over and above the justified avoidance of carbon leakage. And I think we have to worry about how this projects to the trade partners that the EU seeks to engage on this discussion. But many thanks again. It's been a very rich panel and I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Richard, for those questions. I think the people to whom you posed them specifically can come back on them in their closing comments, for which we have just a few minutes. This time I'm going to go in order of the, let me keep the reverse order that we had previously. Danielle, would you like to offer any closing comments? And feel free to pass if you think you've covered it all, but closing comments, responses to what you've heard at the end of this session.
Thank you. Yep. And just going to Richard's point about imports on all EU products, it's a good point, and one it's a point, you know, around adding some fuel to the fire, so to speak, that we've been considering as well. It was really having a scenario like that is really about just trying to illustrate the potential for increased ambition. And I guess that recognises that maybe border carbon adjustments can be used not just to address carbon leakage, but also incentivise action in other countries. But, you know, how realistic is that scenario, and then how much do we actually use it is a good question, I think. So I think it's a really good point. Just generally, you know, I think there is a point here that, yes, the main aim of border carbon adjustments is to address carbon leakage, but I think it's also inescapable that part of the aim from Europe in adopting border carbon adjustments is to incentivise action in other countries. And I think, you know, that's something that our work will speak to, hopefully, in helping to demonstrate some of the benefits to countries of taking action to help address transition risks. Thanks, Aaron.
Thanks, Danielle. I mean, if nothing else, the work will help to pose the question with which we should be starting at any of these exercises, which is, what is the objective, right? It's hard to measure effectiveness. It's hard to make policy recommendations if we don't have agreement on what the actual fundamental objective of the tool is. So let me go to Mark for any closing comments, and they can be, I encourage you now to rise beyond the technical to any higher level thoughts you have about what you've heard today in closing. Mark, please, the floor is yours.
Of course, it was very interesting to confront the different modeling scenarios, but also to collect further questions. Maybe in reaction to what Richard said and some other comments in the chat, I think that, of course, no study can claim to be exhaustive, but actually, paying more attention, we had to summarize today and not to go too much in details, but actually the impact of CBAM and also CBAM combined with other options like trade agreements is clearly that it has spillover, and not only at the benefit effect, and not only at the benefit of the EU. So clearly, even CBAM, standalone CBAM, would be conducive of other countries picking up new low carbon technologies, improving their carbon performances. And in most of the hypotheses we have considered, it was an impact on global growth and not only impact on EU growth. So it was kind of positive outcome. And of course, trade agreements would further trigger positive agreement, positive effect for third countries in this big endeavor to curb down carbon emissions.
Thanks, Mark. And I think this underlines for us the importance of thinking not just about a single tool, but about a suite of tools and the dynamic effects that you have when you put together more than one tool, which is a realistic policy scenario, right? Robert, let me go to you for your closing thoughts on our session, please.
Thank you. I would say the same. I mean, that was quite interesting that we can compare some results with different assumptions, and which is also interesting that we all use the CG modeling, which is quite leveling the results and comparing the same issues. But what I would like to maybe highlight is that we are talking on global perspective. We are talking about the different sectors, both sectors that are under the ETS, or there are questions what to do, how to put the price or CBAM on the sectors which are not covered by ETS. This is open question for all of us because it's challenging for the broader perspective than 2030. But I think the main issue is that even we put the carbon or CBAM on the sectors which are in ETS, it's challenging. I mean, from my perspective, we should start the pilot phase and just put any solution for 1, 2, 3 sectors at once, not more, just to see how it in reality works. Because of the WTO and because of the retaliation from other sectors and because of the US coming into the game. And I think if you look on the schedule, how you can introduce the CBAM in the EU, we are talking about 2023. So it's during the phase before the revision in 2025. So I think it's challenging also in timeline. So I think this is, well, we are discussing very detailed issues, but at the same time, it's only beginning. So.
Thanks. Yes, I mean, it's clearly we're going to have another round of modeling after we see what the actual proposal looks like, because one of the reasons that our approaches are so varied is that we're making assumptions about what that proposal. Daniel, I think, is the only one with the advantage of being able to have a proposal in hand by the time he looks at his modeling results, but I'm sure the rest of us will be coming in as well. Alexandra, the last word goes to you. And I assure all our participants, this is not favoritism on part of ERCST, but maybe it is a little bit. Alexandra, your closing thoughts on the panel and what you've heard today.
Yeah, and maybe just one remark also in relation to one of the comments in the chat, that indeed not all sectors that we looked at and from these countries that I presented today, the work about, were significant in terms of exports to the EU. For example, cement, as they say, does not travel far. But I think it's still interesting to look at these sectors, and because hopefully the introduction of CBAM could encourage imports to the EU from countries far away with production that is relatively cleaner compared to other exporters that are located closer.
I think that's right, and those kinds of dynamics are important and challenging to capture. Let me pass it back to you, Andre. I've run a few minutes over, but Andre, to guide the rest of this the session and the upcoming panel, to which I think we're all looking forward. Andre.
Well, thank you, Aaron, and thank you to all the. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you, and thank you to all the panelists. I think this has been quite a remarkable discussion. And yes, we do talk policy, but in the end, also people like to see numbers. And we know there are models and there are scenarios, but nevertheless, this is how we build. All the plans go out the window in the fog of war, but nevertheless, you need plans in order to prepare yourself for what is coming. So thank you much to all of you. Our plan is very much to continue to do our own work and to invite all of you to continue to be part of this community, because one way or another, there are going to be measures put in place to address this asymmetry which is inevitable in some way. Yes, I know there are people are moving to higher ambition, but until we all get there, we will have to manage the situation. Now, now we will go to our next panel. I think that we will take a few minutes until everybody is here. The next panel, I will remind you again, it's supposed to start at 45. I would like to give people a few moments just to stretch their legs and hands, like the seventh inning in baseball. And the next panel will start with a presentation by Vicente Hurtado Roa, who is the head of unit that deals with this CBAM. Vicente, welcome and good to see you again. Thank you for taking the time again. We know how busy both you and Gerasimos are. And we have a few, have four very interesting panelists that will intervene and react to the presentation by Vicente. And that includes Holger Losch, who's from the German Business Federation, BDI, Daniele Agostini from Enel, Koen Koppenhol, who's the head of Sembiro, and Susanna Droge from SWP. Unpronounceable for me in German. I apologize for that. It's a very long name. Probably Susanna will forgive me as always. So what I'd like to do, I'd like to give it Vicente a few minutes, like let's give it 2 or 3 minutes for people to stretch. Whether there is the proverbial rush people coming back for this, I don't know. But I think that we should give him a couple of minutes and then we'll start the panel. I think we have everybody that I know. I'm looking for panelists. Vicente is here, Koen, Susanna, Daniele. The one that is missing in action so far is Holger Losch. We have sent a party looking for Holger via Berlin, but I'm sure that he will be here. So give us just a few moments to. You have a presentation that you will put on the screen, Vicente.
I think Darius will do it for me.
Darius will do it for you. Darius, you have the presentation.
I hope so.
Yes, we're ready. We can test it if you want.
Okay.
Well, let's test it while we have the few seconds that we wait until everybody comes in, and start 5 minutes earlier, in such a way that people are not getting distracted. Okay, looks functional.
Yeah,
I'm always nervous about these things, Vicente. I never know when it's going to work well.
So am I. This is why I prefer that Darius takes care of it.
A very wise management decision.
Okay, I will stretch my legs as well.
Good. Okay, let's give it like three minutes or so, and then we'll come back. Okay.
Okay.
Somebody has to hold the fort. So I don't know, Koen, whether you're also stretching, but I will hold the fort here for another 3 minutes. Well, oh, there's Holger.
I will hold it with you. I will hold it with you.
You'll hold it, and Holger will also hold it with us. Welcome, Holger. We will wait for a couple. Can you hear us? Holger, can you hear me? Holger? Nope. I think there's a technical problem.
Do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Yes, we can hear you. Can you hear us?
I don't hear you.
Ah, now that is a problem. Koen, you can hear me, right?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so I think the problem is in your end. The problem is in your end, Holger, because Koen can hear me. I don't know how to say that. I'll tell you what, I'll send him a WhatsApp message. Well, we shall wait for a few moments.
Hello, good afternoon. Hello, Andre. Can you hear me?
Who's the, Mr. Agostini? Yes, Daniel, I can hear you. We can hear you loud and clear. We're just having one problem with Holger Losch, and I think he's reconnecting because he's got a few problems. So what we said that Daniela is we'll give it till about 40 or 41 is 39 right now. We'll start a few minutes early. Everybody's here. Holger is having some difficulty connecting, or we can hear you, but he cannot hear us.
Okay. I guess that makes an interesting conversation.
Sometimes it's a winning one. Sometimes it's for the best. Not in this case. Holger, can you hear us now? I think not. Now it's connecting to audio. It did not connect to audio, so that's a problem. Yeah.
Oh, yes. I hear something.
Can you hear us now?
Yeah. Now I can hear you.
Okay, miracle of technology. All right, good. Everybody. Good. Now I'm relieved. It's Susanna Droge that is missing, I think, for the moment. I think she's there. She's never missing. She's there. Very well. Good. Let's start our last panel. I think people will stream back. Probably we've taken a few minutes to stretch their legs. These are long. This has been a long day. It's a 3-hour session. For a Zoom session, it's usually fairly long. It's fairly long for anything, but Zoom especially, I think. We're all suffering from some fatigue of this. So this session is the last session in our 2-day global town hall on the EU CBAM. Again, we said that at the beginning of the year, it's probably a good time to take stock. We are now kind of moving on a line where DigiTaxud and colleagues in the commission are working to put together a proposal that we're all anxiously waiting. So we have the pleasure of having Vicente Hurtado Roa, who is the head of unit in DigiTaxud, which is, as we say in Canada, stick handling this particular file. And we are also benefiting from the very eminent panel with Holger Losch from BDI, German Business Federation, Daniele Agostini, who's head of carbon strategy at Enel, Koen Koppenhold, the head of SEM Bureau, and Susanna Droge, who's has done a lot of work on this with a German think tank, SWP. And as I said, Susanna, unpronounceable for me. I will not even attempt that. So apologies. Vicente, you please have the floor. We'll go through your presentation, then we'll have initial reactions from our panelists, and then we'll also open it to the floor. So can you please, Derek, will you please put the presentation up?
Okay, thank you, Andre. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks a lot. I'm glad to see that you don't get bored of me or you don't get annoyed with me. I'm becoming a regular in these town halls, and I really appreciate that you give us the opportunity to have a window to reach out to, I always say stakeholders, but I would say to interested people in this file, which I think it's a passionate file, which is keeping us very busy, as you said. Now we're in the middle of the preparation of the impact assessment. As you can imagine, it's not an easy task. We have to take into account many things, and I will be referring to some of them today. You asked me to come today to present the results of the public consultation that we held from the 22nd of July until the 28th of October, and I'm glad to come with the results of the consultation. I have to say that there is a caveat. I mean, it's difficult when you are asking people about something that there is not much information, which is completely new, and that we only know a bit about what could be possibilities, but we are not proposing something in specific. So it's difficult to reply for people. But we really appreciate the effort made. We are very happy that we received around 610 valid responses, because we received more responses, but we can say that more than 600 responses. Also a number of contributions with detailed position papers. And that's, of course, very useful for us in order to take the temperature of the stakeholders, of the citizens, of everyone on this difficult topic. Because, as we say, I mean, this is a collective exercise. The Commission proposes, the Council will adopt, the Parliament will possibly co-legislate. But I mean, in any case, it's clear that it's something that concerns all of us, and of course, everyone has something to say. Just for your reassurance, because maybe I will rush too quickly today with figures and conclusions. All the information is available in our website, Have Your Say, which is part of our Better Regulation portal. So if you Google Commission's Better Regulation portal, CBAM, you will go straight to the page or the site where you will find a report and also the contributions made by the respondents to the consultation. So moving on to the next slide, maybe it's important to have a picture of who has responded. I think it's always useful to see who were the stakeholders who responded, and then what is the geographical coverage that we are covering here. It's not surprising that most of the response came from companies, business organizations, and business associations. Of course, academia and research institutions also participated. There was a very low participation by public authorities, but that's not surprising, because normally, well, they prefer to reach out to us through other channels. And what was surprising for me, because it's a very technical and very abstract file maybe, is that we got replies from citizens, a high number of replies, around 28% of replies from citizens, which shows already the interest among the citizens. Well, that's important in order, I mean, to see a bit the distribution of the responses is important for you in order to do your screening of the replies. And then if we look at the geographical coverage, not surprisingly, again, of course, majority from the European Union, but still 17% of responses came from outside, which is also quite understandable, because the CBAM has an external dimension, which is very important, as you know, and as I have highlighted before, and also third countries, companies in third countries, organizations, etc., are very interested in what the CBAM will look like, how will impact on them, and of course their main concern is if there will be double taxation or double punishment or double carbon price if we introduce a CBAM. The consultation was mainly made of closed questions, where you had to choose between A, B, C, D, or sometimes you could choose more than one or two answers. I think there were like 5 or 6 open questions. And the questions were mainly on 5 aspects, and I will refer to them: the justifications for the measure, the objectives with the measure, the design, of course, the scope, and then the impacts, economic, social, and of course, environmental impacts with the introduction of the measure. So maybe we can go one by one. We can look at the justifications. Interesting to see that most of the respondents to the OPC believe that the risk of carbon leakage is expected to increase in the EU because of also an increase in the level of climate ambition. I mean, that's I think very natural, and that's very easy to understand. And then that's why the main justifications for the introduction of the measure would be one to justify the differences of level of ambition between the EU and third countries. That's something that we have also repeated many times. And also, and that's interesting as well, that they understand that the CBAM can contribute to the EU efforts or EU climate efforts, as well as, of course, the global climate efforts. I think it's interesting also to highlight that in relation to unnecessary burden on the EU industry, most of the respondents consider that that should not be a big issue. I will come back to the administrative burden because I think that for other stakeholders or other participants in the CBAM can be of course an important issue. But it was highlighted as part also of the justifications that they don't understand that for the EU industry, the introduction of the CBAM would be a problem. If we move to the objectives on the next slide, we can see that stakeholders believe that carbon leakage is already a reality. And to some extent, they understand that the CBAM will address the problem of the carbon leakage. But not only. I mean, they also consider that the CBAM may foster consumption of less carbon-intensive products. That's also one of the objectives in the EU, and also to stimulate the deployment of low carbon technologies and ambitious climate policies. This is linked to what I said also before about the justifications. I have to say that so far, all the studies on carbon leakage have shown that there was no carbon leakage, that there were sectors at risk of carbon leakage, and this is why now in the ETS, these sectors are compensated by the existence of free allowances. However, in the survey, in the consultation, stakeholders believe the carbon leakage is already a reality. There were more mixed opinions on the effectiveness of the current measures. I refer to the free allocation of allowances. That's one. Another one is, for example, the compensation for electricity costs. So these are the two main measures to deal with the carbon leakage. But there was a mixed opinion about the effectiveness of these measures and other regulatory measures, like, for example, contract for differences, in order to effectively reduce greenhouse gases emissions. And that's, I think, something important. We could see, for example, the CBAM as a good tool to also reduce emissions, not only outside the EU, but also within the EU. And on average, the stakeholders somewhat disagreed, and you can see that on the slide, that the current measures under the ETS can address the carbon leakage in case of the enhanced climate ambition. So most of them were pointing to the need to introduce also a CBAM in order to deal with the risk of carbon leakage. What I want to highlight as well is that on top of the objective of reducing the risk of carbon leakage, 3 other objectives were mentioned, and I think that's very important and very valid. And I have to say that that's also steering our work on the impact assessment. One is to enable policies reducing carbon emissions in the EU. A second one is fostering the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions on a global scale. And the third one is ensuring a level playing field for all producers that have to suffer or support a carbon cost. So that's for the objectives that I think don't bring new ideas. They are in line with our thinking, but I think they are very relevant and very interesting for us also to understand that this is shared. In terms of design and coverage of the measure, as you can see here on the slide, we were comparing the different options that we had already announced in our inception impact assessment, the import tax, an extension of the ETS, that's what we call full ETS, an optional ETS, so a sort of ETS in parallel only for importers or exporters from third countries, and then what we call the excise or VAT type, sort of consumption tax, which would be quite different from the other measures. It was surprising or interesting to read that most of the responders were favoring an import tax or maybe a consumption tax. But I mean, I don't think that the conclusions here are definitive. And I think that you can see that the opinions were very much equally distributed between the different options. I have to say that these are the options that we are analyzing under our impact assessment, and that will, of course, steer the final decision on the measure. In terms of coverage or scope of emissions, there was a lot of appetite, but I will come back to that later on covering direct and indirect emissions. Direct emissions are the emissions emitted by the production of the different products, while indirect emissions are those which are associated to the fuels used to produce the products. And then in terms of sectors, there I have to say that respondents could select up to 10 sectors. And the sectors are more or less in line with the sectors that we have been mentioning and that are part of our impact assessment. So electricity generation, cement with lime and plaster, also iron and steel, ferroalloys, and then chemicals, fertilizers, nitrogen compounds, and finally maybe extraction of crude petroleum. So these were the sectors that have been identified by the respondents as the most promising candidates, at least for the first round. As you can see, also if we look at the center picture on the scope of emissions, there was also some interest in covering the value chain. So that means also covering finished goods that are intensive in those basic raw materials. So next slide, we can go through the main elements that were highlighted by the respondents as important issues to be taken into account. And I can tell you that all of them are part of our impact assessment and of course are part of our reflections. On the carbon content, well, respondents of course paid a lot of attention or brought the attention to the importance of covering direct and indirect emissions. I already mentioned that. I also mentioned that emissions should account for the entire value chain. That means that we should not only look at some raw materials, but if not in the first stage, maybe in the next round, we should also look at the impact on those finished goods which are intensive in raw materials. Then there was also, of course, a lot of respondents concerned with giving the possibility to manufacturers in third countries to prove real emissions. Okay, so that's the idea of certification. Okay, I will come back to that also later on. And then at the same time, if we allow for real emissions, also in a way to simplify the procedures and in order to make it more effective, also respondents were very keen on the use of benchmarks or to rely on the benchmarks for free allocation also under the ETS for the setup or for the design of the carbon content of the measure. And finally, there were also references to the Commission's product environmental footprint method. This is the method that has been developed by some of my colleagues, not specifically for the CBAM, but in general, in order to assess something like 20 indicators of environmental performance of products. When it comes to independent third-party verification, I mentioned that respondents were very keen on allowing the possibility to prove real emissions. That can be done, of course, by a way of certification, or the question whether verification or certification should be allowed to producers to do it on a self-certification basis or through independent third parties. The preference there, not surprisingly, was for independent third parties verification. This is related also to the circumvention risks. There was a lot of concern with the circumvention risks, either in the form of supplying production or with pollutant fuels, with non-pollutant fuels, possibility of rerouting production through third countries which are less pollutant, or, for example, the substitution of products between those which are under the CBAM and those which are not under the CBAM. The circumvention risk is clear one of the main headaches and nightmares. If we introduce a measure, we want it to be effective. So that's one of the things we are looking at in particular. There were also references to the export rebate. I mean, if CBAM will fully replace the free allocations, as you know, the free allocations have currently one advantage for EU producers, that reduces the carbon price, and not only in the European Union, but also when they export to third countries. So one of the main concerns sometimes is what happens with the competitiveness of EU producers in third countries, because in that case, they will have to pay the full carbon price. while they will have the same situation as importance when it comes to a CBAM in the EU market, that will not be the same in third countries. So I'm not going to conclude here that there was an appetite or a big preference to keep export or to introduce export rebates to compensate for free allocation, but there was indeed an interest to look at this option. So that's something that we need to discuss internally, how to deal with the export rebate. And in relation to exemptions, it could be exemptions for individual companies, or it could be exemptions for countries. In general, the idea or the perception is that respondents didn't like the idea of exemptions, so no exemption should be granted. However, there was some opening or some acceptance for exempting partner countries which are supposed or are considered to apply the same climate policies as the European Union, and that will also create incentives for emission reductions in those countries. Now we can move, I think, to impacts. As I said before, we ask about their appreciation of what would be the impacts, or economic impacts, environmental impacts, social impacts. I will not go into all the details, but maybe I will just highlight the main issues, or the most interesting ideas. One, in terms of economic impacts in general, they consider that the impacts will be quite positive. It will encourage the consumption of low carbon products. It will increase innovation. It will increase, of course, also competitiveness of the EU industry. And in general, it will have a good impact on investments. So that was the appreciation. If we want to look at the downside of the measure, the problem raised was the increased cost for EU businesses in downstream sectors. I mean, that's linked to what will happen with those sectors if they will be covered by the measure. And that's also, of course, linked to the discussion on administrative burden. In terms of environmental impacts, not surprisingly, respondents generally say that the impacts will be positive. This will improve the effectiveness of policies against climate change, will reduce carbon emissions globally, and will promote the adoption of ambitious climate policies in third countries. That's not surprising either. When it comes to administrative burden, I mentioned before that when we talk about the justifications, that in general they consider that there would not be considerable or important administrative burden or cost on EU producers. However, 95% of the respondents suggest that the CBAM could increase administrative burdens for exporters and importers. Well, not surprisingly, again, I mean, the CBAM will fall on those actors. Almost 93% of the respondents consider that it will also have an increase in administrative burden on public administrations in the EU, and I have to include the Commission. And then the majority also consider that there might be a higher administrative burden for SMEs. As you know, we always pay much attention to not overburden SMEs as an important economic sector in the European Union. So that's in a nutshell, and sorry for rushing through too quickly through the main conclusions or ideas that we have extracted from the consultation. The consultation will be part of our impact assessment. It's one of the annex where we have to explain what were the main reactions of stakeholders and how these have been taken into account in our analysis. And I can assure you that, of course, this will be part of our analysis. And with this, Andre, I think I can stop here, and I'm happy to take questions and also to follow up on the discussion among the rest of the panelists.
Thank you, Vicente. Thank you very much. Would like to go through the panelists, and then we can have a conversation with all together. So, if we could start in the order that we have here, was Holger first. Holger, you still here? Yep.
I'm still
okay.
here.
All right.
First of all, thank you for the invitation and for the good work you are doing constantly on CBAM here. Just a few points from an industry perspective. First of all, we understood that the European Commission will present a legislative proposal concerning the introduction of a CBAM, so I call it CBAM, on imports, and it follows two targets, we understood: encourage other countries to do more on their climate ambition. Secondly, prevent carbon leakage for European production. So it should not be relocated outside Europe. Well, we recognize that it is very important for the EU to, if it presents a CBAM, which is addressing carbon leakage risks, so we need a lot of evidence and good evidence of the risk of such leakage. So I think we see a growing risk, and this has been clear from the previous speaker. People see this risk, so we are now at 35 euros a ton. We have a considerably growing ambition, so the targets are going to 55 with still unknown effects on ETS and others. And so we can easily think that the carbon prices are going to go up quite considerably over the next years. So I think it is good to think and to research on the growing carbon leakage risks and how they can prevent it. I have to underline from an industry perspective that it is at this point not at all clear how a CBAM could work. So we've heard there is a lot of looking at several alternatives, this notional ETS for importers with a discrete pool of special allowances only available to them. We heard some other ideas before, but what is clear, and this is very important for us, especially if we look at the difficult trade years we have behind us, it has to be compatible with the WTO rules. This has always been a central point. And while the WTO is apparently declaring that it never will stay in the way of environmental protection, and of course, we know from other countries, Mexico, Canada, and perhaps probably now the US again, who are also looking into CBAMs. So there is a lot of need to talk to partners. And I think transparency is key here. Europe does not do itself a favor if it's going its own way. So we have to check all of this back with our friendly and other partners in trade, and consultation therefore with all of the partners, but of course with industry or others being affected by a potential carbon border adjustment measure is from our side, that's absolutely clear. I see one aspect which concerns me. Well, the Commission has clearly stated that CBAM needs to contribute to reducing global emissions and avoid carbon leakage. So it declares CBAM primarily as a climate policy instrument. On the other hand, it has clearly declared that it wants to generate new revenues for the bloc out of this. I think this can and already does foster misunderstanding with other countries. I'm convinced that generating new revenues and genuine revenues for the European own resource for the member states is probably not a good idea. I think this will not go down well at all with potential partners and with other countries we want to oblige to accept a carbon border adjustment measure. Another point of concern closely linked with this is if you think of developing countries that had to pay import duties or whatever these payments might be called in the future, a CBAM might even appear a bit perverse, because under the UN climate finance rules, it should be the industrialized countries that support the weaker countries. So I think if the EU does not abstain from collecting CBAM payments as own resource, in my mind, this might lead to some opposition to CBAM, especially among formally well-behaved partners in the global climate process in the developing countries. I would like to remind the nice attempt to include international flights into the EU ETS. This didn't make a lot of friends for Europe at this point. So I think that when we look at what has happened yesterday in the United States, this really opens, hopefully, a new door for really looking into collaboration on this. And this makes it for me even more important to collaborate, to be very transparent, and to take the partners into the discussion. Because now, since yesterday, we are not the lonely front runner we are looking at anymore. So we are now most probably in a climate competition. And we should be very careful if we go how we go about with our competitors at this point. Let me one last point. I think we have to think very carefully about how we design a potential carbon border adjustment measure if we look at the other countries. So how could we decide whether a country or what a country is doing to protect the climate matches our expectations, our ambition, and even countries and even companies might say, oh, we're doing a lot, but we don't have a central emission trading scheme or whatever you want from us. So I think this takes a lot of sensitivity to talk to other countries if we are trying to apply a carbon border adjustment measure and really carefully decide what we expect as sufficient in terms of climate ambition from other countries. This might be a very difficult process, especially with some of the developing countries and even some companies who might say, hey, we have a company target for climate, for CO2 reduction, and now you're putting a carbon border adjustment measure on us. So there are a lot of questions. Undoubtedly, we have to do more in the future coming on carbon leakage protection. But on the other hand, we have to be very careful to make this a success if we want to implement it in the end and not a cause for rift and division with other countries, partners, or developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Holger. I'll go right away to Daniele Agostini, who's the head of carbon strategy at Enel, one of the leading European and global utilities these days. Daniele?
Yes, hi, Andrea. Thank you again to the Roundtable for organizing an excellent event. I think yesterday's sessions and today's session were very good food for thought. And some of you may wonder, what has a utility and electricity sector got to do with CBAM, given that normally we talk about the industrial sector. And for Enel, this is important, mainly because we're not going to have any sustainable climate ambition if we don't tackle just transition piece of competitiveness and jobs in Europe. So it is important to clarify how we manage this issue that is bound to become more increasingly important in our pursuit of sustainable decarbonization. So that's a tack that we're looking at. As most of you probably know, Enel is rather ambitious in its climate strategy, and we have a very aggressive industrial plan. But of course, we're concerned we all need to work on this together, and we make sure that all of European industry is on it. So if we go and look at CBAM and discussions we've had yesterday and today, the way we see it, we see that there's two dimensions, obviously, to it. One is an internal dimension, and I think the results of the consultation prove the support that, in principle, CBAM has in Europe. I would like to thank the European Commission for presenting those results, is also the commitment to addressing something that is a very difficult issue, and it has been ignored for too long in our eyes. So if we just look at some of those results, of course, they're in line with our vision. The main sectors that should be tackled are the energy intensive sectors. Surprisingly, we see electricity prop up. There is an issue with electricity on the margins on some of the regions. We see it also from a electric point of view. In the Hispanic Peninsula, we have imports from Morocco that are growing and could be growing further. On the eastern side of Europe, same kind of issue. We might have similar issues in Greece. So again, the sectors, we agree. I think it's pretty clear that there's a consensus on those. Some of the issues that maybe have not really come to stage yet is a bit the just transition issue. And I think that was tackled on what type of impact. I think it was tackled with some of the presentations we had. What is the impact on final consumers? I mean, we're bound to create maybe some more European jobs, it looks like it from the presentations that we saw in the previous session. What will be the impact on the price of some of those final products and which segments of society it will be impacting. So again, in the end, we're very concerned in making sure that this decarbonization is sustainable. Just transition is central to our strategy, and for that the impact assessment of the European Commission really looks into both sides of the just transition. On one side, the occupational side, but on the other side, the impact on prices for the most exposed and vulnerable segments of our society. So I think from an internal perspective, internal to Europe, the main issues on CBAM for us, again, is just transition really. There are some technical issues, but as we have seen, they can be also overcome. On the external side, of course, things get a lot more delicate. And of course, being a company, we do not really feel we have the possibility of really taking a strong position. Because of course, on one side, we do want to make sure that there's a level playing field at the global level. But as it very quickly emerged also in yesterday's panel, there is an issue that's been historically present in the UNFCCC debate of differentiated common responsibilities. And so there needs to be a very careful navigation, not so much of our relationship with some of the more established trade partners like the US. I don't see a big issue. I mean, they're putting up their measures. It's going to be difficult to prove that they're less ambitious than ours. China is doing the same. I think where really is going to get difficult is emerging economies, developing countries, North Africa, I'm thinking of Turkey. That's where it's going to get tougher. And so just to finish, I think the reason for which we really welcome the debate on CBAM is really tackling the issue of how do we compare ambition across countries. And again, this has been an issue that's been neglected, or we didn't want to tackle it for the last 5 or 6 years. Some of you may recall that in the last revision of the ETS directive, there was a clause that said, we'll be reviewing things depending on the outcome of global negotiations. The truth is that, as far as I can see, but maybe Andre, you're very active with the roundtable at the global level, as far as I can see, there's no international debate on how we compare ambition across different parties of the UN. Now, that is a very difficult issue, but at some point it will have to be tackled. And I think it's inevitable that with the CBAM discussion, this issue will be tackled because it's the only way to decide whether the CBAM is applicable or not. So in that sense, we really welcome the debate on CBAM and are planning to take a very active role in it, both within Europe, but also outside Europe in international negotiations. I'll leave it to that. Thank you, Andre.
Thank you, Daniel. You just made my day, as somebody used to say, because this is the next project on our table. On our drawing table right now. It's a very demanding one. There have been a few attempts at this, but not as much anywhere as what will be needed. But let me go without further ado to Koen Sembirolis, and this is in my mind, and maybe you don't agree, some others agree, but in my mind, this is a cement idea. I mean, first time I heard of this was Lafarge many years ago. Maybe it's not right, maybe it's not correct, but that is what's in my mind. And certainly cement in the past has been very, very supportive of this idea. So very interested to hear your reaction to what Vicente has presented, but also your reaction in general.
Okay, thank you, Andre. I mean, I will not go back to the discussion a few years ago. There are a few nuances to that, so I will not bring up that whole discussion again. But look, I mean, we are looking at this discussion with an open mind. Let me just start by saying that this discussion on CBAM also will fit into a legislative package that looks at the full Fit for 55%, which is not only the CBAM, a more wide range of legislative initiatives. But also for us, it's framing into a broader context. We have issued, as a cement industry, our roadmap by 2050, carbon neutrality by 2050, which means that indeed we will need to do investments in Europe. And these investments need to be done against an environment which gives us legal certainty and which gives us a secure environment to invest. And I think that's where the CBAM fits in. As we said before, yes, there is already carbon leakage at this stage. And I would like to mention that carbon leakage is not only about the risk of relocation, it's also the investment leakage that is there, which many people don't really make as a point. And then also recognized by the Commission is the fact that this CBAM is not addressing the same type of carbon leakage as the ETS directive is addressing. ETS is indeed mainly focused on relocation risk. This is all about the carbon content of imported products. And I think that is relevant to address both aspects of carbon leakage. And I think I've always had my board telling me, how is it possible that we can build a house in Europe with more CO2 content? And, you know, that is not being addressed by the ETS. And right, that was right. So I think this is a point that I want to mention. Before I go in a few design and coverage issues for the CBAM, let me also emphasize and come back on one of the comments of a previous speaker who said, yeah, cement is not really traded too widely. I would contest that view. Cement and clinker are traded and are traded widely across the world. The problem with our sector is that everybody confuses cement, clinker and cement with concrete. Of course, your buildings are made of concrete and concrete is not moving or not moving as much. But let's really make sure that we make that distinction between cement, clinker and cement on the one hand, and then our end product, which is concrete. And I will come back to that when I'm talking about the value chain. In terms of design and coverage, a few comments. We're talking about indeed different design options, and Vicente has named them. I mean, the tax and probably indeed also the notional ETS. I see these different options, and there are reasons why some of these options are preferred over others. Part of it is a WTO compatibility, which is standing a little bit cross with how it will be treated in the European Union. The tax will be easier from a WTO perspective, I understand, but it will be more challenging within Europe because you will need probably unanimity unless you use the passerelle clause, which in itself, the use of it also needs unanimity. So that's a challenge, and that would probably for Europe make it easier to go to the notional ETS system, which then again poses more challenges in terms of the WTO compatibility. So I think these issues need to be taken into account. The consumption charge is for us an interesting concept, but I understand that it's too early to address that at this stage. Too little research has been done into it, but it's another possibility to go into. I heard yesterday about the excise duty. That is new for me, so I will not comment too much. I didn't think that that was in the picture, but I would be interested to hear from Vicente how far that is advanced and what exactly that would mean. As to the scope, I'm coming back to indeed direct and indirect, and I would really emphasize also the importance of indirect. When we decarbonize with our sectors, we will have an increased electricity demand. If you're looking at carbon capture, which is an important technology for us, we're talking about between 50 and 120% more electricity needs, depending on the technology. But that means that the inclusion of indirect costs is indeed important. And there, I would also like to make the point on the end product. As I said, concrete is not moving much along borders and across borders, but basically cement and clinker are moving. And basically, if you look at cement made in third countries, you can say that's a low carbon cement, It may be, but if you then look at the end product, concrete, they probably add some constituents at the concrete stage. And that's where the life cycle assessment of the whole product supply chain is very relevant. Maybe to make a short side remark on this one, I think that export rebates for us are also an important issue. Export rebates can be justified also from a WTO perspective from the principle of the destination country or destination principle, which means that you're treated in a third country in the same way as the domestic producers and also in the same way as other third country importers who are not constrained by the same CO2 constraints. For us, that whole trade area is important. Coming back to, yeah, but concrete is not traded, no, but cement and clinker are. And at the same time, what we see is that in the surrounding areas around Europe, we see a build-up of capacity. We have a 180 million tons production in Europe of cement. We're seeing building up capacity on the borders of the EU of about 70 million tons between 2018 and 2025. That is a significant amount being built up. I'm not saying that all of this will be imported into the European Union, but you see indeed these capacity builds up in the third countries. We have seen between 2014 and 2019 a doubling of the imports in the European Union, with also changing business models in the sense that the clinker production is happening outside of the EU, then the clinker is brought in the EU and ground to cement, which means that the CO2 intensive part of the cement manufacturing is happening just outside the borders of the EU, and grinding installations are there at the borders of the EU. So I think something really to take into account. Last point I would like to make is that there is a lot of discussion going on about, yes, but you're asking for double protection because you're asking for a combination of free allowances existing alongside the carbon border adjustment. I think there is a misunderstanding there. We're not asking for a double protection. We're asking for a system where the application for the third country would be the emissions in the third country compared to the benchmark in Europe. And we do not ask third-party producers to pay what we do not pay. If we do not pay up to the benchmark for the free allowances, we do not ask third-party producers to pay the same. What we ask is that they would pay between their emissions, whatever they are, and then the European benchmark. And their emissions, you can have an assessment on, is it an EU average, is it a global average? We would suggest an EU average, but that is up for discussion. But we are not asking for double protection. That's clearly not the case. And therefore, in our view, the free allowances can coexist with the CBAM. Also, again, from a perspective of investment security. The free allowances have been decided in the ETS 2 years ago. The system phase 4 is up and running. Our companies have made their investment plans till 2030, taking into account these free allowances. That's really relevant in terms of also the decarbonization areas. Very last point, we need to take into account that indeed there needs to be a carbon cost on both third country producers and European producers. There is an element with third country producers. Take a company that has 10 plants in a third country, only one plant exporting to Europe, they will be able to spread that cost amongst their 10 plants and in the group, which the European producers will not be able to do. That is something that maybe need to be taken into account. But again, we're not going to measure it on a pharmacy scale to see whether there is an absolute equality. But I think cost compensation and a cost equality between third country producers and European producers needs to be there. So that was just by way of introduction, my remarks, André.
Thank you. Susanna, you have no installations that I know of. So you take a more detached and analytical view, but also one that is very much tempered by the political realities of all this.
Yeah, well, I mean, interesting enough, my predecessors mentioned a number on my list, a number of issues already on my list, so I could tick the boxes and not double mention these things. But let me take a bit of a distance view. I think what is interesting at the moment is that the consultations and the overall talk about CBAM has triggered so many dynamics about the Green Deal, about what this instrument is for, good for, not so good for, and also the interest of our trade partner countries in what the EU has planned for has risen tremendously. So this taken alone, this aspect is very interesting to me, and obviously also to others who worked on this, analytically worked on this tool before. We've heard already that, well, the consultations went well, and I think this is no surprise given that it is obviously something that is shaking everyone awake, and in the backdrop of anticipated carbon prices rising in the EU, interest of industries made a U-turn, basically in some sectors. I swear it is a U-turn. So we've seen or heard today some keywords I would like to probably add to the debate. And so first of all, I think that all the implementation issues that Vicente highlighted from the consultations are, of course, not something the EU can solve by itself. I mean, it could legally, no problem, doing this like with the aviation directive embedded in some kind of international context. We don't know yet the context except for the Paris Agreement. This could be done in theory, but in practice, this is total nonsense because it will backfire. So I think the international impacts are clear. We've heard about them, we've talked about them a lot. But still, let me highlight that, of course, if you take the flip side of the debate we have within the EU about industry competitiveness and so on and so forth, the flip side of this is that others that trade with the EU and are in competition have the fear of double carbon pricing in mind, or charges or regulation, and this will not be seen or heard, or they have in mind that there are common but differentiated responsibilities and capacities. So I think that all the implementation issues that were highlighted in the consultation presentation by Vicente boil down to these aspects. When we are talking about how to decide on which carbon content is applied product by product, or rather default values, I don't call them benchmarks here because maybe someone's out there and has already looked into the actual benchmarks that are used for free allocation, whether or not they are fit for purpose. I don't know, maybe that's another research. But of course, this carbon content decision is a decision that needs to be made compatible with WTO rules, if that is the primary goal of the legislation, and also, of course, of embedding it in the multilateral context. And then, of course, trade partners will make up their minds how to challenge this in what kind of dispute settlement system. I don't want to go into details, but this is, of course, the implication from the implementation on this end. Then I heard already that third-party evaluation, that's the good news from the consultation, should rely on independent parties. This needs to be brought also to the international level, I guess. And we know that methods are available, data are available. So the question here is, how could the Commission make use of it and not only, using own data and reinventing the wheel, because this, of course, relates to the traded goods evaluations, and this has to be transparent. Otherwise, we get into deep trouble when justifying what we're doing at the border. Another one is the circumvention risk, and as said, reshuffling and transshipment closely relate to certification and the transparency of what is being measured. And I think that also here, international rules matter a lot, also for the WTO, because in the fora or even in disputes, there's a great deal of interest to agree. Are we talking about rules of origin here, or do we have certification that really lives up to the expectation that that's a clear and reliable system? And then the export rebates. Okay, of course, we turned it down a lot in our analysis because we think that under WTO rules, this is very close to subsidies that are not allowed, that are prohibited or actionable. In combination with free allocation, this risk could rise. On the other hand, if you take this idea that it's all about carbon leakage, if you take this step back, then imagine an EU ETS, for instance, without any free allocation. What would the EU have to do? And there is, in the current directive, we hear that free allocation is supposed to end sometime. What should the EU do if it wants to take serious action about carbon leakage, if it works both ways, through exports and imports? And that is where I think this debate will not end soon. I don't have a solution here, but just what I'm saying is that there's not only the argument from the consultations and from industry, just as we heard that export rebates could play a role. It's more or less the question here to justify the whole CBAM based on what the intention is to fight carbon leakage. So I will stop here. I don't want to make it more complicated, but luckily Daniela and Holger mentioned a number of other things I also had on my list, especially the exemptions, what to base exemptions on. Let's discuss this all together with the audience, maybe. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. I'm asking the participant to intervene. I know that I have questions here and I can have recourse to the questions. I'm old-fashioned and I prefer to see live people. We cannot see live people and touch, but at least at the minimum, we prefer to see people actually take the floor rather than me regurgitating their questions. And I think just that not dynamic enough, so I'll leave that to you. But before I do that, I'll give the floor back to Vicente to react to some of the things. I think it's only fair to do that. One of the things that one of the people who had to leave kind of mentioned, and I also think it's probably useful, this excise tax versus the consumption charge. I suspect that you are a taxman and understand these things very well, but my suspicion is that for most of humanity, it is somewhere lost in there. The second thing is also, I'm a little bit puzzled, Vicente, because it's called carbon border adjustment mechanism, but we talk about consumption charges, which is essentially a domestic thing. So I mean, I'm worried that I'm asking a very awkward question. I guess sometimes we use a label like like HSBC that nobody knows what actually it means, but it's just been a kind of a name that we use as a big box type of thing. But I give you the floor, and then I'll go to some people that are beginning to raise their hands.
Okay, thank you a lot, Andre and the rest of the colleagues for the remarks. As you can see from here, and that's also for the audience, I mean, the CBAM is a complex exercise for sure. There are many things that have to be resolved, and that's where we are working now. But I mean, all your reflections, your comments are very, very much appreciated. Maybe I will not be exhaustive with all the comments, but I will try to pick up the most important ones or the more relevant ones. One made by Holger is the issue on resources, and I thank Holger for raising the point, because I think there has been some confusion. It's clear, I think it's clear for everyone, that the main objective of the CBAM is intended to be a measure to fight against climate change and to reduce emissions globally. Globally means outside, but also in the European Union. And of course, the fact that the three institutions have agreed that the revenues from the CBAM could be a new own resource for the EU budget has nothing to do with the main objective. And I can assure you that the decision on the measure, on the type of measure, on the sectors, on everything has nothing to do with resources. The fact that this becomes a non-resource has an advantage, is that all the revenues can go straight to the EU budget, and therefore they can be channeled through the Just Transition Fund and through other mechanisms in the EU to finance also the movement or the transition to a greener economy. I think it was Daniele who mentioned the issue of the Just Transition Fund, the importance of analyzing it. I mean, that's something that, of course, we pay much attention to, and it's also part of the debate. But here we concentrate more on the aspect of the revenues, and then the other thing is, of course, what we do with the revenues. But I mean, I want to clarify, and I can understand that talking about own resources may a bit divert the attention from the main objective, and can be used by some to criticize the CBAM as a protectionist measure with the only intention to raise revenues, and that's really far away from the intention with the measure. The other point that has been raised by everyone, and I think it's a very valid and very important point, I didn't mention that because for us, is the bottom line is, of course, the compatibility with the WTO and with all international agreements. agreements and engagements, commitments of the European Union, like the customs unions with Turkey or the free trade agreements with some third countries. For sure, any proposal that we will be making, that we will put it on the table, and any of the options that were listed as possible design measures are WTO compatible. Of course, the devil is in the details. The important is in how you introduce the measure. And that's why we are discussing here, or usually about how to measure the carbon content, how to take into account the carbon price paid in the countries. I think it was Daniele who mentioned the issue of taking into account the efforts, the climate efforts made by third countries or by producers in third countries. It's not only paying an ETS or a carbon price, it's other type of efforts. I mean, that's something, of course, that we are looking at, and that's very relevant and important. We are engaging with the countries. We have already been contacted by many of them. Canada is one which is very, very much interested in the measure. You know that there is already a CBAM in place. It's California and Quebec, and even California now is considering extending it to cement. We don't know what the Biden's government will do. They announced, or at least Biden announced in its program for the elections, a sort of measure similar to the CBAM. But of course, before doing that, they will have to make sure that they have an effective carbon price across the whole country. And that's something that is still not available or possible. Biden yesterday was very reassurance. He's coming back to the Paris Agreement. So we hope that with the US, with Canada, there will be a dialogue. We are open to dialogue with all the rest, with Russians, with Indians, with Chinese, whoever is interested. Of course, the main interest here and the main objective is to make sure that they also contribute to reducing emissions. That's the final objective. The best CBAM is the CBAM that will not be needed. That's to say that the CBAM that makes sure that third countries will introduce measures. And of course, we are doing all this in a very transparent manner. We are going to reach out to all main trade partners and to explain the measure, to explain that this is not a competitiveness measure, that we don't want to punish their production. We don't want to interfere with trade. We just want to make sure that we all contribute to reducing emissions. So that's going to be the main message, and I hope that will be understood. I understand that part of the industry has concerns with the retaliations. We know that now the US has launched countervailing measures against free allocation. We are very much aware of all that. We will try to make sure that all we do is done in a transparent manner, and of course with the awareness of the countries with respect to what we are doing and why we are doing. Hopefully, we will find also partners. I mentioned Canada, why not the US, maybe Japan and Australia. So hopefully we will be able to get a club of climate friends that will see the CBAM as a measure to put pressure on the laggards. Other things, Koen, thank you. You mentioned many things. You talk about carbon leakage is also investment leakage. We know we are taking this into account, and that it's also about the carbon content of imported products. I completely agree with you, and that's of course one of the ways in which or how we assess also the carbon leakage. You refer to the export rebate. It could be justified. I have to say that some have concerns about the justification of an export rebate. An export rebate can be in two different ways. One is what I think most people understand, which is a sort of refunding the cost of the ETS, some sort of, well, I mean, what the free allocation is doing now. But an export rebate is also a measure of introducing an exemption for import-export. So, for example, if you are importing steel and you export the same steel, or you export a product which has used this imported steel, then you don't pay the CBAM, because in the end the product will be shipped outside the European Union. That's something we are looking at, but I have to say that there are many people, many experts who have concerns about WTO compatibility. I think it has to be looked at, and that's what we are trying to do. Maybe a sport rebate, which is at the level of the free allocation now, in the case that we completely remove free allocation, could be justified. But anyway, I mean, that's of course, that's something we are, I mean, I'm not saying that we are proposing an export rebate, but that's something we want to look at, and we understand and we know that the discussion around that. In terms of design, yeah, the import tax would work very similarly to the notional ETS. In essence, they are the same. In practice, they are completely different. An import tax is an import tax. It's a tax applied on the import of the goods, something similar to how, for example, a customs duty could work. It's completely different from a customs duty, but in the technique would be something similar. National ETS is something like introducing an additional ETS market, which would run in parallel to the EU ETS. The consumption charge or the excise duty measure is introducing something different. It would fall not only on imports, but also on EU production. It's like a sort of, it could be like a VAT, that's one of the options, or it could be like an excise duty. We have, for example, that for energy products. We have that for alcohol or for tobacco. I'm responsible of the three, by the way. So that's something we know very, very well. But of course, that would have to be linked to the ETS in one way or another to avoid an overlap with the ETS. The idea is that we set the same carbon price, final carbon price for the products sold in the European Union, either in the form of an ETS for EU products plus the top up that would be the consumption charge. And then, of course, the consumption charge would fall completely on imported products. The advantage, as Koen said, is that is more robust from a WTO perspective. It's like the energy tax directive that we have in place in the European Union. The problems with the tax options, and I'm a tax expert, of course, is the rule of unanimity, and Koen mentioned the passerelle that we could try to use, and I think that here is a case where we should use the passerelle. But okay, there are pros and cons with the different options, and that's what we assess in our impact assessment, in order to come with the most effective and efficient and less cost or costless, mostly costless measure for the introduction of the CBAM. Koen also referred to free allowances, CBAM. We don't want double protection. I completely agree. In any case, there shouldn't be and there won't be any double protection. If there is some sort of phase in, phase out, we need to look at how this could be possible. But of course, the idea is not that the industry receives free allocation, and then there is the CBAM on imported goods that would pay even a higher carbon cost than EU producers. That for sure is not on the table, and that's not an option. Again, that brings us to one of my first points on the compatibility with the WTO. Other issues. Well, I think Suzanne went through the main points that were raised in the consultation. We are working on all of them. We need to take into account all views, and of course, we need to see what can be reasonable, feasible, and with a less administrative burden as possible. And I think with that, I think I covered most of the points. Electricity, there were some questions about electricity. I know that the imports of electricity are very low in the European Union. I think it's around 2%. And most of them come from Norway and Switzerland. But the truth is that the dependency on electricity will be increasing. And the fact that most of the imports are from Morocco, but also from Russia, Ukraine, and also from the Balkans. And someone referred, I think it was Daniele, thanks for that, referred to a report by, well, they used to be called SAMBAC. There is a good report on carbon leakage in the electricity sector. So I think that the impact now is not too high, but it's true that there is an issue there. And what we want is to avoid that the problem will get out of proportion. So that's why countries like Spain and also the Baltics have been proposing the introduction of the measure on the electricity, together possibly with steel, cement, fertilizers, chemicals. This is the most promising sectors at this moment. And over to you again, Andre. I hope I cover most of the points. I'm sure that not all the questions have been answered. That's because we are still analyzing them. You will get the answers when we will come we will come to the light with the impact assessment. The intention is to finalize the impact assessment before the springtime or around the beginning of springtime, and then we will come with our legislative proposal by June. At the same time, we will come with a very comprehensive package of review of the ETS, effort sharing, renewables, and other climate and energy related policy measures, also at the same time in June.
Vicente, thank you very much. Indeed, a very comprehensive and very to the object response. Appreciate very much, and I'm sure that everybody appreciates all this very detailed. Bill Thompson, I think, Bill, you've raised your arm, and I congratulate you for that. So, Bill, you wanna kind of ask the question, please? There are many questions in here, but you've answered many of them also, Vicente, in answering the panelists. Bill?
Many thanks, Andre. I was very intrigued by the inclusion of the electricity sector as the top sector for CBAM. And I'd had a quick look at Eurostat, and the answer was it's 0.3% of electricity consumption by end users. So this is a relatively, it's a very big sector, but it's a very, very small proportion. And I suspect there are many other sectors which have a much greater proportion of imports. So the next point is about capacity. So is this going to increase rapidly? And particularly from those countries which are perhaps have a much higher carbon footprint, so excluding Scandinavian countries. And the answer is, well, interconnection capacity is itself constrained. So is this a rather small issue relatively? Now, you did mention that there were one or two perhaps sensitive member states to this. You mentioned Spain, and you also mentioned Eastern European states. But I think we have to be quite careful here. We're looking at an EU-wide measure. If you wanted to have a member state measure, then you should devolve it back to the member states. And that, of course, would give you a very difficult CBAM, which would be nationally based and I suspect almost impossible. But I was, again, surprised by the electricity sector and that it was such a big issue for members and perhaps, as you mentioned, an important issue for the Commission. I welcome comments.
I think that probably, I don't see any other hands up. I will go to a couple of questions from here.
I'm sorry, Andre, just to, I mean, given that the question was right on the power sector.
No, I was, that's fine, Daniela. Just let me add one question in here, if I may, and then you can come back. So,
yeah,
so we
sure.
have
Happy to also take it at the last round. So, if
yeah, no, but I knew that you're gonna go for this. I mean, as a fellow electrician, I can't blame you for that. The one thing that was asked is that also from Vicente is that you presented answer to the closed questions. How about the open-ended comments and attached documents? How will that be handled? I see, Susanna, you had also something that you wanted to raise, and then we can go back to comments to Daniela and everybody else. Susanna, you had one.
Just to understand better why we have such a large share of 27% EU citizens. How are they defined, or how did you filter this? Because I think, at least here in Germany, we had some interaction with some groups that were probably defined as citizens are rather NGO style, because the share of NGOs was rather small. Just a technical question, just to understand why it's really a lot.
Daniela, you want to start, because you obviously this Bill kind of went into some discussion of the electricity industry, and then if anybody else, then we'll go back to Vicente. Daniela?
No, and thank you, Bill, for raising that issue. And also that, I have to say, that was my first reaction when I read it, because we have been active for 5 or 6 years on the carbon leakage, and Empower has never arisen. There's two dimensions to it. One, first of all, we need to think generally when we talk about carbon leakage, there's carbon leakage on the global markets, and I'm thinking steel, oil and gas, probably chemicals, but then there's carbon leakage on the regional markets. And there I'm thinking of cement and electricity. And those are the areas where actually transport is constrained. So I'm sure that Cement is not so much concerned about cement in central Germany, because as we know, direct competition from outside Europe to central Germany is rather limited, but it's more about competition with Northern Africa, Southern France, Italy, Spain, that region. So you have to look at the regional aspects. So then on an aggregate level, at European level, it may have not that much of an impact, But then if you start talking to cement plants in Southern Europe and Spain and in Italy, it's a problem. Similarly with power, you have the issue, aggregate is not a problem, but if you talk to the Polish PGE, to the Finnish people, to Portuguese, and we've seen the comment now in the chat, to the Spaniards, it is a big problem at the regional level, and it has a big impact on real communities. I mean, these are people who are impacted by this and who are being frustrated by this, on one hand. On the other hand, on the interconnection, it's a completely different dynamic from that of the oil and gas sector with which you're familiar with. You have a big pipe, and today Spain and Morocco are exchanging probably with a zero balance across this pipe, depending on the time of day, the time of season, and what is going on. The problem here is if that big pipe now starts flowing only in one direction, importing electricity from Morocco. And it gets even more sensitive if it starts doing that from Russia, because obviously, we have an issue. So again, I agree, it's a very different, but it's a very real problem for those two issues that I just mentioned. The regional dimension on one hand, and the fact that obviously interconnectors behave in a very different way. So the numbers are indeed misleading, but it is an issue. And again, I encourage you to read the report, it's very effective.
Well, I've never been active in the electricity industry in Europe, but I was in Canada. We had a big problem between Ontario and Upper New York State, Niagara Mohawk. We had a lot of industry that was importing. Well, it was a death spiral at some point, and we had to arrest that. So I do understand.
It creates a lot of animosity between neighbors. Yeah.
No, sorry, I mentioned before the two cases of CBAM in the world, Canada and Quebec. And the two are on electricity, only on electricity. So I think that shows that it's a sector that attracts the attention. And I completely agree with what Daniele said. I mean, I think that it's true that maybe now we can see that as a regional problem of some peripheral countries that import from some North African and Eastern countries, but with interconnections that can become a big issue in the future as well. And it's true. I mean, Spain, Portugal have been doing a great job, and I mean, a lot of work struggling to get rid of coal plants. And I think that they don't want to ruin all that over the night just with cheap imports of electricity, which depends on coal. So that's why we were looking at the sector. And of course, what I said before, I mean, the dependency on electricity will increase. So I think we should take that upfront and not just to wait and see the problem arriving.
Okay, well,
Andre, I will have to leave you at 6 because I have another meeting. So if there are more questions for me, I'm happy to take them now. Otherwise, I think these have been real good troopers because they've been around. Many people have been around for 3 hours, and I think that CBAM is exciting, but at some point it may be not that exciting for more than 3 hours. So I'm trying not to stretch the envelope. I would like to just, I think at this point, I'd like to go to the panelists and say any last comments so that anything that Vicente may want to address. Anything left? It is 17:57, so we have little time. Anything else that you would like to raise before we conclude? Holger, Koen?
Well, maybe one point, I mean, coming back to the regional issue, I mean, this may be true for the moment, but there is still carbon leakage in Europe at this stage. But I can tell you, we did some heat maps towards 2050, and with the increased emission reduction targets, we will have indeed also Germany being affected. I mean, don't forget that at this stage, there is not only Northern Africa, but there is also Russia, Belarus coming into Poland at this stage. So I think it's really a matter of time when we have the whole of Europe under a red heat map in terms of carbon leakage. And a second small point I would like to make is that indeed, it was mentioned, I think, by Susanne, we need to make a clear assessment of how are we going to determine third countries' equivalence in terms of measures being taken. I'm referring to the Financial Conglomerates Directive, which basically talk that there need to be equivalent and appropriate measures in place. In this case, you would say we measure a third country according to whether there are equivalent and appropriate reduction efforts that match the objectives set by European Union legislation. And I think that will create a cost basis which is equal or which is comparable between the jurisdictions. I think that's an important point.
I think that listening yesterday to Tim Profeta, that's kind of right or wrong, and I have, I'm not that deep in the democratic machine, but his view was that there wasn't going to be a federal cap and trade in the U.S. with a tax, with a price. How are you going to compare level of efforts when there's no such a clear thing? I think this is going to be, but don't worry, we are coming to the rescue.
Good.
Holger, anything from your side? No. Okay. If that is the case, then all I can say is 1759. I think I couldn't be more precise than this. I've asked other folks if they had anything else to add. There's nobody else. Vicente, thank you very much. As always, you've been a real kind of somebody on the money and answer the questions. Doesn't happen very often. I want to thank you for that, and thank all the panelists that have joined us. Very interesting conversation, different points of view. I had hoped that more people would raise their hands and be active, but so be it. We'll as somebody else said, we'll be back. Certainly, this is a conversation that will continue. So thank you again very much, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks all.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Andre.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.